Astronauts Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin sitting there atop the great Saturn rocket in their command module.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
What a moment. Man on the way to the moon. It seemed that the whole world stopped as man set out on the adventure to escape from his own planet and to set foot on a distant one.
The space race had its origins in the closing years of World War II. During that time, Dr. Wernher von Braun and his team helped to develop the V-2 missile, which rained terror down upon London and other Western European cities. As the war wound down and the Allies were advancing upon the Nazis, Dr. von Braun was sent south to Bavaria, where he and other key personnel surrendered to the Americans. Once in America, Dr. von Braun led a team that designed the Juno 2 and Saturn 1 launch vehicles, became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, and was the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle, which carried the American astronauts to the moon. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ended up designing America's space program to be led by civilians, so that it would provide a nice contrast with the secretive Soviet space program. After World War II, the Cold War occurred between the US and the Soviet Union during the years of 1945 to 1991, and was also when the space race occurred. The Cold War involved competition in many areas such as nuclear arms, and was in full swing when the space race started. Many cite October 4th, 1957 as the start of the space race, as that is the date when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first ever artificial satellite, greatly embarrassing the United States. A few days later, the United States' response to the first Sputnik was to launch a Vanguard TV-3 rocket with a satellite that tragically exploded, further embarrassing America politically on the world stage. Under pressure due to the tragic Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba that failed, President John F. Kennedy wanted to triumph in an area of space where the United States could be first and actually have a little bit of a head start on the Soviet Union. As a result, the race to the moon had begun. Although the Soviet Union beat the US to many milestones in space exploration during the Cold War, the Apollo program is one of mankind's greatest triumphs, as it overcame many obstacles including the tragedy of Apollo 1 to succeed. This led to the US winning the space race and impacted humans to this day through the technologies developed for the Apollo program and the private space companies that are taking the next steps into space.
The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was signed into law by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson on March 3, 1915, with the mission
to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight with a view to their practical solution and to determine the problems which should be experimentally attacked and to discuss their solution and their application to practical questions.
As NACA started working in space in the 1950s, it established a special committee on space technology which was aimed at creating a public-private partnership to develop a space program. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1957, it sent the American people into a full frenzied panic. In direct response to the Sputnik's launch, President Eisenhower authorized the creation of NASA, which absorbed NACA's assets and personnel. President Kennedy needed to turn attention away from his administration's tragic failures, and so President Kennedy famously declared that
this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Putting a man on the moon and returning him safely was unlike any triumph that the world had seen to that point in time. In order to make the mission more manageable, it was broken down into 3 sub-projects: Project Mercury, Project Gemini, and Project Apollo. Project Mercury had the 3 following goals:
to orbit a manned spacecraft around Earth, to investigate man's ability to function in space, and to recover both man and spacecraft safely.
3 weeks after Soviet Union's Yuri Gagarin became the first man to go into space, Alan Shepard became the first American to triumph when he went into space with his 15-minute suborbital flight. When it came to orbital flights around the Earth, once again, the Soviet Union had tragically beat the Americans to defeat. So, on February 20, 1962, John Glenn became the first American and second male to triumphantly go into orbit around the Earth. Overall, Project Mercury was a triumph, and it seemed best to have another project post-Mercury before NASA went to the moon. That project was Project Gemini. The main goals of Project Gemini were
to test an astronaut's ability to fly long-duration missions, up to 2 weeks in space, to understand how spacecraft could rendezvous and dock in orbit around the Earth and the moon, to perfect re-entry and landing methods, and to further understand the effects of longer space flights on astronauts.
On June 3, 1965, as part of Gemini 4, Ed White triumphed when he became the first American to go on a spacewalk with his 23-minute stroll in space. Even as the Americans continued to triumph with Project Gemini, such as Buzz Aldrin's record-setting 5 hours and 30 minutes of EVA time during the Gemini 12 mission in November of 1966, they also began to experience tragedy. While astronauts Elliot C. and Charles Bissett were flying a T-38 training jet, they crashed into the very building where the Gemini capsule had just been completed. Overall, though, Project Gemini was a triumph and Project Apollo was set to start. Project Apollo got off to a tragic start when the Apollo 1 capsule went up in flames by a fire that was most likely started by a short circuit from a bundle of wires. Astronauts Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee all perished in the tragic fire. As a result, all Saturn IB launches were suspended for a year for an investigation to figure out what had transpired and how to prevent it. The safety probe made it so that the hatch would open outwards instead of inward. Much of the flammable material would be replaced with components that would self-extinguish, and there would be a nitrogen-oxygen mix in the cockpit instead of pure oxygen, as oxygen is highly flammable. As Dr. David R. Williams noted,
the changes made to the Apollo command module as a result of the tragedy resulted in a highly reliable craft, which, with the exception of Apollo 13, helped to make the complex and dangerous trip to the moon almost commonplace. The eventual success of the Apollo program is a tribute to Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, 3 fine astronauts whose tragic loss was not in vain.
After subsequent Apollo missions, including Apollo 8's triumphant lunar orbit on Christmas Eve 1968, capturing the iconic Earthrise and ensuring that the Saturn V rocket could make it to the moon, the stage was set for the triumphant Apollo 11 mission.
On July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission took off with Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module pilot Buzz Aldrin aboard their Saturn V rocket. On July 20th, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the Lunar Module Eagle onto the moon's surface, and on July 21st, Neil Armstrong became the first man to step foot onto the moon. Once on the surface of the moon, Armstrong triumphantly declared,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
with over 500 million people worldwide watching him utter his words, forever changing the course of mankind. While on the surface, Aldrin and Armstrong conducted several experiments. The astronauts also left an American flag, a patch honoring the Apollo 1 crew who tragically died, several other items, and a plaque on Eagle's leg reading,
Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind.
While Armstrong and Aldrin were on the moon, Michael Collins orbited the moon in the command module Columbia. The astronauts' tasks were sent back to Earth via TV so that people of all ages and nationalities could see a history-making triumph.
The Apollo 11's triumphant mission forever changed the course of human history. By triumphantly landing on the moon before the Soviet Union, the United States, for all intents and purposes, won the space race, cementing themselves as having superior technologies, and thus being the superior nation. By winning the space race, the US gave its citizens a nice triumphant break from the tragic debacle of the Vietnam War and the tumult resulting from the tragic assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. Among the technology developed from the Apollo 11 mission and subsequent moon missions were solar panels. Solar panels will be part of the ultimate triumph that will be needed to ensure that the most tragic effects of climate change can be averted. After Apollo 11, there were 6 more missions to the moon, but Apollo 13 had to turn back after an accident occurred. Michael D. Tanner, Deputy Director of ASTRO's National Climatic Data Center, said,
I remember as a 10-year-old watching the moon landing on TV and becoming excited about the possibilities ahead. The Apollo 11 mission inspired a generation of engineers and scientists, and I am one of them.
In the years since the Apollo program, space policy has changed from president to president. Under President Donald Trump, he has issued his Space Policy Directive 1, which will reorient the American space program from landing on an asteroid to triumphantly return to the moon as was done by Apollo 11 and from there to Mars. President Trump said,
Marks the first step in returning American astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972 for long-term exploration and use. This time, we will not only plant our flag and leave our footprints, we will establish a foundation for an eventual mission to Mars and perhaps someday to many worlds beyond.
Companies such as Boeing, Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, and the United Launch Alliance are all private companies that are working with NASA in helping Americans reach the next frontier in space and/or developing capabilities for private spaceflight, a giant triumphant leap for mankind, as Neil Armstrong will have most likely said.